Anyways, here we are on the shores of Tern Lake at the junction of the Seward and the Sterling Highway, which I'm sure you've heard of before.
Now, this whole area used to be one giant swamp fed by Dave's Creek. However, road construction caused Dave's Creek to fill up and flood this whole basin.
At first, the lake was called Mud Lake, not the prettiest name for a lake. However, this changed to Tern Lake to promote tourism.
Seward resident Willard Dunham was new to Alaska during this time. He needed a job and he ended up driving tour buses from Seward to Cooper Landing. That's no easy task on the muddy, bumpy, and very buggy roads.
Willard Dunham has been a civic leader in the development of many projects in Seward, including the Alaska Sea Life Center. You might be surprised that in the 40s, Willard was a cab and tour bus driver.
In 1949, Harold Malcolm bought 3 buses to move into Seward to begin Malcolm bus lines from Seward to Hope and to Cooper Landing.
Harold Malcolm hired Willard to drive tour buses on Tuesdays and Thursdays. These are the days that the steamships would arrive in Seward. He would load up his guests, most of them were women, and head off on the bumpy, dusty, $10 adventure. It wasn't just a road trip, though. They would stop in Loing and visit with Alaska Nellie, stop in Moose Pass to meet my grandpa, Ed Estes, and on to Tern Lake. Only it wasn't called Tern Lake back then.
And from there we would go to make a stop out at Tern Lake, which is Tern Lake now. It was called Mud Lake in those days. Well, Tern Lake was is, and still is a very beautiful little place. And it's full of all sorts of active wildlife, very active with the birds. In those days, it was very common to see moose in it all the time. There was quite a to-do over that. A lot of the older people were not very happy. The old-timers around here weren't very happy that they changed, because it always had been Mud Lake.
After a stop at Mud Lake, the bus would continue down the road and eventually make it to Hinton's Sportsman's Lodge at Cooper Landing. The passengers would have lunch and then return to Seward by 4 in the afternoon, for the visitors to get back on the steamship. Today, a trip like this would be taken for granted, but back then the roads were unfinished and were very rough and narrow. The Kenai road system was still in the process of being built. Indeed, only a few years earlier, such a trip by car wasn't even possible. The roads didn't even exist. You've got to remember that before there were roads on the Kenai, there were trails, and before there were trails, they were routes. When viewed from space, the Kenai Peninsula looks like a jumble of peaks. However, if you look closely, you'll see the deep, wide valleys laced through these mountains. This unique landscape is the result of plate tectonics and glaciers. It was these wide valleys that became transportation routes, first by the Dena'ina and the Alutiiks, then later by the Russians and early explorers. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, these became more established as trails in order to access the gold fields. It was during this time, during the early 1900s, that the railroad corridor was surveyed from Seward, reaching into the interior of Alaska. But in regards to the roads, where would they be built? That was the question. Typically, roads followed the rail system. However, there was a need to connect areas of development on the eastern Kenai to the port of Seward. This included the gold fields of Hope and Sunrise, along with Cooper Landing, an area which was popular to sportsmen. Therefore, roads were surveyed following established trails and routes that often were separate from the rail corridor. But it didn't happen all at once. It took decades. First, a rough road was established between Moose Pass and Sunrise in 1913. In the 1920s, the Seward and Loing segment was constructed, as was the road from Mud Lake to Cooper Landing. Then, in the 1930s, a section was added to the south of Moose Pass. But people still weren't able to drive from Seward to Moose Pass. The section between Loing and Snow River, along the Kenai Lake, became known as the missing link, problematic because of the steep hillsides. However, in 1938, this route was finished, which in turn allowed for the development of businesses, such as the Malcolm bus lines. However, just because the roads were built doesn't mean they're like our roads today.
We called it three-track road because it was not wide enough for two cars to pass on each other, and you had turnouts. Sometimes a passenger car could get by, but most of the time not, and especially with the big buses that we were driving. Somebody'd have to back up. The game in those days was to see if you could out-bluff the other one that had to back up. So.
No, the roads certainly weren't like the highways that we see today. In addition, the Eastern Kenai road system was isolated. More roads needed to connect to Anchorage and to the rest of the Kenai Peninsula. In 1943, a rail spur was drilled through the mountains to Whittier. It wasn't until 1949 that the road was finished from Cooper Landing to the town of Kenai. And with the construction of Canyon Creek Bridge in 1950, this led to the final completion, the link to Anchorage in 1951. Although it would be quite some time before they would be paved, the completion of the road system ushered a new era for the Kenai Peninsula. Tourism continued to be an important part of the local economy. Planes replaced steamships and new roads were built and improved.
What used to be bumpy, dusty, and buggy roads were eventually paved. Visitors and residents could then travel throughout the Kenai Peninsula quickly and in comfort, but the bugs did remain.